Hello, good afternoon. My name is Careen. I am the lead for SDGs and Impact at UNEP, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the last session for today on UNEP's Global Roundtable of 2022. This session is to talk about the next steps to mainstreaming impact management, and I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. You're seeing on the screen with me Romina Boarini, who's Director at the Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunities at OECD. Dimitrios Dimopoulos, Head of ESG at Piraeus Financial Holdings. He's also Head of Corporate Development. You see also James Wallace, Executive Director of Corporate and ESG Reporting. And last but not least, Eric Usher, who is the Head of the UNEP Finance Initiative. So, as said, delighted to welcome you for this last session of today's Global Roundtable. The theme this year for the Global Roundtable is transformation and acceleration. And as you will have noticed, if you've been listening into the previous session, you'll have probably picked up by now that in terms of UNEP's perspective on that, that very much means change at the system level, change within the institution, across the institution. We were hearing earlier on about the need really for action across the value chain, all the way from not just within financial institutions, but it's also the real economy, its policy, and its regulation. That is effectively what it takes for us to be able to manage our impacts as humankind, impacts to ourselves, impacts to the natural environment in which we find ourselves. And so impact management, the theme for this session now, is at the end of the day, it's very much a nuts and bolts process. It's a lot of things that need to happen internally, a lot of steps. And so the purpose today is really to dig down and understand a little bit better where have we got to exactly in terms of impact management? What has that transition meant within organizations of different types, as you can see around the panel today? And what really are our next steps to really accelerate that and take that further? Because it is quite a big transition. It is quite a big change. And so, Dimitrios, if you'd allow me to turn to you first. You've been with Piraeus Bank for many years now. You've also been with UNEP for quite a few years. You were here in 2015 when the Positive Impact Manifesto was launched. You were here in 2017 when we released the Principles for Positive Impact Finance and we defined impact within the finance sector. And you were certainly here in 2019 when all of that really took on a new level with the Principles for Responsible Banking. And Piraeus Bank, along with 100 other banks, took on a commitment, and since then, another 100 took on the commitment to actually perform impact management, to do impact analysis, to set targets. So I was wondering, could you perhaps, to kick us off, share a little bit, from your perspective, what is it that has changed in those years where impact and the notion of impact management has become front and center? And where do you see Piraeus Bank being at now in the middle of that change?
Thank you, Careen. Well, I can say that the heart of the Principles for Responsible Banking that was launched in 2019 is actually about impact. It's about increasing the positive impact and reducing our negative impacts. So impact is a concept that we have starting to realize how important it is for banks. Because until now, basically, I can say that banks are more accustomed to outputs and outcomes. Impact is something very different. And being the second principle of the PRB, and banks are now actually embarking on how they will be able to measure impact and what it means for their business decisions. I think there's still a lot to be seen in the future, and there's a lot that banks will have to do in order to be able to fully grasp the concept of impact and actually understand what is the business case behind that. Now, coming to our personal experience as a bank, yes, we were involved from the very, very start in 2015, and we were involved because we were intrigued by the word impact. We were trying to understand what it actually meant. We felt that there was something there. We felt that that was where banks would have to go sooner or later. So we joined from the very beginning, and we were very lucky in one respect that we were able to participate in working groups that UNEP set up. We were actually instrumental in preparing a tool that UNEP developed, actually two tools for measuring impact, one on a corporate level and one on a portfolio level. As a bank, we have implemented the tool that UNEP has developed, and we've done 2 impact assessments using 2 different versions of the tool, and now we're getting ready for the 3rd impact analysis report, which will be based on the new and 3rd iteration of the tool. So it's giving us a very, very good insight on where we have impacts in areas where, in some cases, we consider it as being obvious, but also in areas where we didn't even think of that, we would have an impact, either negative or positive. So now we're actually at a stage where we're translating the outputs of this tool into targets, first of all, into understanding what it actually means, and then linking it to our business, the business decisions, and then coming up with reporting and moving on to the next steps, which is delving further down into what impact analysis really means for us and for banks in general.
Thanks, Dimitrios. Thanks so much. James, perhaps I could turn to you next. So at UNEP, we're obviously very much focused on the finance sector. We've heard already, though, very clearly in previous sessions that at the end of the day, if the finance sector and the banks, the insurance companies, the investors are to meet targets that they set themselves to achieve certain impacts, to address the SDGs, they will only ultimately be able to do so if their clients, their investee companies themselves also engage in a transition and meet their own targets. So it's absolutely great if you could share with us what your experience has been from a corporate perspective, and what are the sorts of frameworks, tools, resources that are representing that shift in the corporate world itself. Do we have James with us still, or have we lost James along the way? Okay, I think James has had a technical difficulties in the middle of reconnecting. So let me perhaps carry on and perhaps ask Romina for your insights from a slightly different angle. There's obviously let's say the practitioner perspective on doing impact management, going through the process of impact management. But obviously there's the whole policy and regulatory environment around that. And there's certainly been a lot of movement in this sphere. I wonder if from an OECD perspective, where strongly on policy issues, and from the perspective also the WISE Centre, where you're specializing in cross-cutting issues, which is what we're looking at really with impact, what your regulatory perspective.
Thank you so much, Careen, and well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. We are very excited at the OECD to be able to support this important conversation around impact. And indeed, let me say that the number of initiatives that we have seen and policy that connect with impact and sustainability have been growing recently, which is of course very promising. And before I share more detailed insights on the learnings from this new initiative, let me just very briefly remind the urgency here to handle social challenges. I think this is a very important focus, in particular for the WISE Centre that I have the pleasure to direct. We have seen that the social challenges recently have been sort of compounding and have sort of started increasing really fast. We released a study on SDGs just a couple of months ago, and we actually look at the SDGs performance of OECD countries. And on social goals, I would say the performance has been very disappointing. If you look at goals such as the gender equality goals or the inequalities goals, or the number 5 and number 10 respectively, no single target can be classified as close to being reached for OECD countries. And we know that the pandemic and now the war are heading to the challenges. If you look at issues that connect with economic insecurity and instability of OECD households, we see that just last year, 1 in 3 people in 22 European OECD countries were feeling left out of the society. And as we all know, the average inflation in OECD countries has been increasing. In August was at 10%. And last year, 1 in 5 people in OECD actually had difficulties in making ends meet. And so we understand that those challenges, as I said, are growing. They're not going away. And so definitely, these are on the tops of the very big wealth inequalities that we have observed. So I think this is just to say that, of course, we are all very delighted to see that global action has happened and is happening when it comes to climate and biodiversity. Those, of course, are objectives that we do embrace and we do support as much as we can, but we also insist for the necessity to address those challenges, having clearly mind the impacts on people and on societies. This is why we really think that we need to put at the core of this transition and change the notion of impact on people and on planet. As you said, a lot of different initiatives are taking place right now. So on the one hand, the great demand from investors, we've seen a number of initiatives, Business for Inclusive Growth, it's a business coalition, but also, of course, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero, many others. So these are all looking for measures of impact on people and planet. And again, we're here at the OECD to encourage and support those efforts. But when it comes to policy and regulations, there are a few initiatives that I'd like to mention. First of all, we know that much has happened in the reporting and disclosure space. So initiatives that focus on mandating disclosure on sustainability-related issues at national or regional level, SEC, EFRAG, but also at global level, the work that is being done by ISSB. And there is an ongoing question there on the extent to which reporting on impact, as opposed to just on sustainability, should be integrated in those mandated disclosures. The discussions is ongoing, but with the partners that we have at the moment, we really are of the opinion that we shouldn't neglect impact regardless of the materiality perspective that it is taking. The other policy example that I want to mention is the mandatory due diligence regulations. Due diligence is one tool in the broader impact management toolbox, and we know that the due diligence tools are focused on identifying, mitigating, and addressing the adverse impacts, for instance, in the very important areas of human rights and the environment. We know that in some jurisdictions, in particular in the EU, there is a lot of focus now on implementing legislation on mandatory corporate due diligence. And that very, very positively builds on global standards of responsible business conduct, for instance, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and all the range of due diligence instruments. Of course, we know that different jurisdictions have different levels of ambitions. That remains a challenge, but we are working with all the different jurisdictions, but also within multilateral fora such as G7 and G20, to ensure that we push policy and regulatory action to actually happening in a very, very coherent and consistent way. We need to take a look at the bigger picture here. What is happening in sustainable finance really, really means a big change in the capitalistic system. It means we need to drive change in terms of resources allocation, towards a system that is able to better internalize the company's negative externalities. This is not always, so easy, but we also know that the challenges that we are now facing are urgent, and it's definitely time now to redesign the system and to catalyze all the very important initiatives that are happening. So I think we are heading in the right direction right now. Much of this revolution is happening, and so we are here to continue supporting this very important agenda.
Thank you, Romina, and thank you also for always, it's important to remind ourselves that just because we're starting to do the right thing doesn't mean that the job is done, and actually the scale of the challenges is growing as we speak, and the urgency is rising as we speak. And so thank you for reminding us, in particular around the social issues, and definitely also important to remind ourselves in the, as you say, the policy and regulatory toolbox, the fact that there are disclosures and then there are other instruments at our disposal as well. I see that James, we have back on the panel. We have some technical issues with video, but I believe James can hear us and that we would hear you. Perhaps I can turn back to you again, James. Earlier on, Dimitrios shared experiences from the banking sector, a banking experience of integrating gradually an impact management practice. And we were very keen to hear from you what that looks like from a corporate perspective, as we know that one without the other isn't really going to take us to SDG accomplishments. And so keen to hear, what has been that evolution for you at Novartis, and what are the sorts of frameworks and resources that you're starting to use and to mobilize to make that shift towards impact management?
Sure, thank you very much, and hopefully you can hear me okay. But and yes, apologies for the connection here. I'm not in my usual location. Yeah, I mean, Novartis has been working on impact for quite a number of years now, as many of you will know. We've got quite a well-established impact management system, working with the Whitehall Institute, and we've been sort of, monetizing our positive and negative impacts, not only of the operations, but also the impact of our medicines and sort of health outcomes on patients for some time. It's a very complex process. It's still exploratory process in many respects, and that methodology is being developed further. And it's the Value Balancing Alliance, I believe, is the name of the association. Roche has also joined. So from a medicine and pharmaceuticals perspective, we're blessed by the fact that medicines truly contribute to reducing mortality, reducing pain, and having very good positive impacts on the SDGs. And, implicitly, we've been sort of reporting on SDGs for some time with that integration. So we also had that built into our materiality process, because that's kind of a key thing to ensure, your stakeholders are all sort of making sure that you as a company, your strategy is focused on the right issues. But when you look at that sort of impact metrics and things, that there's still some way to go to getting it to be, I guess, corporate and audit proof. I think that's the real challenge. So I mentioned it's exploratory in nature, the impact methodology, and it really is groundbreaking, but it's so complex and involves so many third-party proxy values, independent sort of scientific values that have to sort of be sort of calculated against your business core metrics, that auditors struggle at the moment to sign that off. And this is a challenge they're working on, and hopefully we'll get there soon. And the challenge is making that impact methodology nimble enough to work alongside core financial reporting and metrics, and more sort of conventional non-financial reporting and metrics, if that enlightens at all.
Thank you, James. No, it's an important point that's made there in terms of how to integrate effectively the question of impacts and what traditionally has been monitored and disclosed from a more financial perspective, and raises the the question that nevertheless remains at many levels in terms of the links between enterprise value and between impact at the end of the day, which is perhaps a good transition for me to invite you, Eric, to perhaps come in and reflect on, where does this land us effectively? We do see that it's quite challenging times globally. We know that the world is in the middle of big changes, also geopolitically, everything and so on. And so, how do you see, having heard what we hear from our members, but also here having the benefit of also corporate entities and policymakers and regulators come to the global roundtable? What are really the opportunities for more, let's say, of a consensus view and more of a common language across these different players across the value chain, which seems to be quite key still in terms of landing the pieces of the puzzle into something that makes sense? So, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, thanks, Careen, and everyone. Obviously, this is an extremely important discussion, and we're seeing a really important evolution from just a couple of years ago. Impact was still impact investing, and it was a focused part of the investment activity. It had been developing for years, developing some very important approaches, but we were still lacking the mainstreaming of it. And now this is what we're seeing happening very quickly now. So there are different pieces to break down to say, how can you, or how is the progress being made? How can it be facilitated? I think there's the legal issue. And we've been very happy to be working with Generation Foundation and with PRI in trying to clarify how impact orientations align with an investor's fiduciary duties. And actually, Al Gore this morning in his speech spoke a little bit about that, and important work is being done there to make it clearly understood that it fits within your duties to be including an impact or an outcomes orientation within your normal investment activity. So I think progress is being made there. But I think another big evolution, and Dimitrios, you started to speak to this, is impact. And of course, it's important to investors, but investors' engagements from corporates are often at a fairly high level and obviously are on big, important issues. But if we really want to see progress, we need to move from those, annual discussions between an owner and an operator, essentially, of a business activity, to, let's say, within banks, to the hundreds of thousands or the millions of client relationships that you have in terms of how business really works with its banker, whether it's a corporate, whether it's at the retail level. And how do you embed the notion of impact and impact management into those types of engagements? And as Dimitrios mentioned, impact is at the center of the Principles of Responsible Banking framework, the first responsibility for signatories. And today we have a little over 300 of the world's mostly larger banks. Together, they account for almost 50% of global banking assets. And the number one requirement when they sign up is to instill, to put in systems to monitor impact across all lines of business, which is a huge ask, very complicated issue. How do you monitor impact in everything that you do? And so this is really leading to a real change. This is no longer something specialized. This is something we need structures that we can apply to everything we do. Of course, there are a lot of developments, like in the EU, the taxonomy, like under EFRAG, and in many other regions as well. And so that leads to the second major development, but also challenge, is that there's many things going on. And several speakers have referred to that, almost too many things. And so we need to push towards standardization, mainstreaming and standardization. We are getting that. Certainly the launch of the ISSB last year at the Climate COP was a very important step, and all of our organizations and many others are feeding into that process to create a standard set of essentially impact disclosure approaches, so that all corporates will be disclosing in a common way, standardized way. And so good progress there. Last point is, most of the emphasis there is around disclosure, and that's important, first step. But when we in what we're talking about here really is impact management. And James, you referred to that. That is then a further stepping up. It's not only being able to measure, but it's also the question is then how do you push more positive impact, less negative impact from your different lines of business. And we're very pleased to be joining, co-chairing with OECD and myself working directly with Romina and many others, the impact management platform, which is a coming together of actors working on the notion of how do we move from disclosure to management around impact? What are the tools? What are the standards that need to be developed? How do we essentially prove out working with both corporates, but also different parts of the financial sector to actually develop these approaches? So how do we move standardization, but also I would say the standards actually are not low ambition. They're actually increasingly growing and focusing on where we need to go, which is impact disclosure, but impact management as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. So we've gotten a sense of where we are now, which is a bit of a mix of, okay, we've really moved on to something new, and many things are starting to to be put in place within organizations in terms of the policies that are being worked on, and yet quite a way to go. And so perhaps focusing now more on indeed the next steps, so that we both indeed mainstream and perhaps standardize a little bit more the practice of impact management. Dimitrios and James, perhaps both of you could speak to us a little bit about what you see as your next steps. I mean, Dimitrios, you were mentioning that as you got into this, there's something around the holistic nature of looking at impact, because you're suddenly having to realize that things are interrelated one to the other, that you cannot necessarily pick them off one by one. And so you discovered in the process, other topics where there were impacts to be managed. So is that the new horizon? Is it about, internal processes? Is it, indeed more the engagement that Eric was talking about, saying, well, how on a day-to-day basis do you engage with clients? James, you mentioned, the complexity of an approach that you've taken that's more centered around a monetization approach that you've undertaken in the context of the VBA. So what are the next steps that will really be necessary for you to take this to the next level and really start to see the results? Dimitrios, you go first.
Shall I start, Careen? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a very nice question. I have to agree that there's been a lot of progress since 2015 when we started talking about impact within the banking sector. But I feel that there's a lot more to be done. Standardizing and mainstreaming issues that Eric and Romina brought up are very, very, very important. I think what we have to do as next steps as banks is to actually deep dive into understanding what impact is, because it's very complex, as you said, Careen. It's about developing a holistic view of how I can see and how I can measure and how I can manage my impacts. It's something that banks will have to do and translate the results that come out of these impact analysis into how they can actually have an effect on the real economy, on real people, on the environment, and on climate in general. So setting targets and being able to monitor and measure the results of these targets that they'll be setting will be, I think, a challenge in the coming years, and that will actually require a change in culture within the bank. We have to go from looking at things in very segmented and fragmented manners into a more synthetic, into a more holistic approach. And we're living in times where all the issues, the big challenges that we face, climate change, biodiversity, energy crisis, and all the rest, are very, very complicated, are very complex, and they require cooperation and synthesis in dealing with them. So I think UNEP will be able to help by improving the tool that we've already started and we find it very, very useful, we as a bank will commit to continue being part of that working group to improve the tool and come out with a fourth and fifth version or whatever, so that it can actually be able to depict as better as possible what impacts are and all the rest. And as a OECD, it'll be very, very interesting to see how we can standardize the approach to measuring impact. So that I think, Careen, in a few words, is what the next step should be regarding banking sector.
Thank you, Dimitrios. James, your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, it's a really interesting line of thought. You know, we've also been using the SDG impact tool, you know, from the UN as well, which has been really helpful in actually sort of road testing our materiality process to make sure we've got the right issues covered in that stakeholder analysis. And I think this is good for many sort of organizations starting out their journey on this path. I think it's a great sort of challenge to make sure you're reporting on the right issues and your strategy focused on them. I think though, when you actually sort of, you know, impact is actually helping us in a couple of additional ways, which is something I wanted to mention in the public policy debate at the national level. You know, it's really helpful for our affiliates to be able to have a measurement of impact, you know, from the medicines, from everything else, and have that discussion with governments and more sort of saying, okay, you know, this is sort of the social financial value that as a company we're also bringing to. Yes, there's negative impacts, yes, there's historical issues, but overall this is the positive benefits we're bringing to the populations as well. And I think that's a really interesting thing. You know, from the investors' perspective, we've probably got a handful of investors who are interested in impact, and I don't think they have a clear understanding of how to measure it or how to assess us at it. You know, we're seeing some of the rating agencies try to do standardized, very simplistic tools across portfolios, which then has the issue that, you know, this one size fits all across the entire investment universe probably doesn't give you too many insights. So you got to be sector specific, and you got to be more. Now, I guess the key challenge facing us and many companies is this rise in regulation, and the regulation around reporting. And it's everywhere, it's every country, Switzerland, the US, Novartis has two sort of domiciles, and EU more widely too, where our affiliates are based. And part of the issue is that data now needs to be signed off by the board. And the board wants any of this data to be absolutely audit proof. And therefore the impact methodology has to be audit proof. And many of the auditors at the moment, unless it's an internal methodology developed, they're not always willing to sign it off at the moment. They're looking at it, they're working on it, but this is the challenge. And the next steps for us in Novartis is, let's help, whether it's the value balance alliance, whether it's the UN SDG impact methodology, whichever methodology is, let's make sure it's to the same level and quality as our financial data, as our other non-financial data that we can get audited, and then we're in a good place. As Eric says, there's many great applications of impact as well. It's not just about reporting, it's about sort of helping assess which medicines work best in which country and how we can sort of help governments produce better health outcomes for all.
Thank you very much indeed, James and Dimitrios, for those insights. I'd love to turn to Romina and Eric now to give more of an institutional perspective on, you know, what you see as the next steps. You know, we hear this feedback from, you know, Dimitrios and from James, kind of looking to standardization, but also making sure, you know, as was just said, that we're on the same level as other types of information or existing information in terms of the, you know, the quality and the auditability, for want of a better word. What do you see as, you know, the next steps, whether it's, I guess, for our institutions, the, you know, multilaterals like the OECD, like the UN, and also, I guess, what we can do collaboratively between those organizations. Romina, I don't know if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think we need three key things. First, we need to continue measuring, and in fact, we have to improve the current methodologies and measurement frameworks. The second is about better understanding the evidence about what matters for companies and how that relates to impact. And the third is indeed the job of standardizing. So on the first point, I think we heard from all panelists this afternoon that despite a lot of progress has been made on the metrics, on the understanding of what drives impact, there are still so many open questions. And I was particularly interested by the last comment by James when he was talking about audit-proof data and auditing-proof data processes that Novartis is working on, and I'm sure that many other companies are exactly doing the same thing. One of the issues we saw as we were working with corporates and investors on those methodologies, we indeed realized that there is an issue when it comes to the quality of those data, and that's very much about how we understand, for instance, the S in the ESG framework, but also some other components in the E and the G, and so definitely we need to do a little bit more to make sure that the protocols that are used are really considered of high sort of relevance and value. And I wanted to mention some work that we have done in the Wise Center together with national governments, and again that goes back to James' point about how can we make sure that, this is obviously a public-private sort of conversation, and there is a lot of sort of interoperability across the public and the private standards for measuring impacts. And so in the Wise Center, we have, in fact, developed a framework for measuring business impacts on well-being that is building on our own framework for on well-being for governments. And so we really started from the same sort of conceptual tools, but we wanted to make sure that we would unpack and roll out the framework for sort of the purpose of understanding the business impacts. And a lot of work still needs to be done when it comes, to the indicators. But again, the ambition there is really to sort of have something that is fully aligned with government methodologies. The second issue is about better understanding how input is relevant for investors. But from the perspective of understanding how input affects enterprise value. So I want to go back for a moment to the notion of materiality, because this is very often sort of a dividing line among those that are interested in this agenda. There is a very interesting body of evidence, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, that suggests that good stakeholder well-being outcomes is good for business as well. So it's these two notions are not in contradiction with each other. I just want to quote studies from the ILO, for instance, that were finding that if you look in companies, that are really promoted gender equality and gender diversity, so the ones that have are doing really well from that perspective, they actually have increased, the profits and in general their sales by quite impressive numbers. There was last year a very interesting report by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Development and Shift that was showing the impact of living wages, again, on the profitability of companies, and many more studies. So I think I really wanted to stress that again, there is no contradiction or no obvious contradiction between impact and profits. And so really companies and investors should work on these two objectives as being sort of twin and mutually consistent objectives. Final point, obviously, on the need to continue standardizing. Of course, you mentioned, Careen, the work, and Eric had already mentioned the important work we're doing in the context of the IMP. For us, that is really key to make sure that we are sharing the resources on how we, across the multilaterals and the other industry organizations that are taking part into IMP. There are so many important tools, many data that have already been produced by these organizations. And what is very interesting about the fact that those partner organizations are working together is that they actually have committed to streamline what they have done so far. So they know that they've been developing tools, and in some cases these are fit for purpose tools. These are tools that indeed are relevant in different geographies and markets. And at the same time, all those partners understand that, again, those tools need to be brought together in a very clear way. And so that's what we're doing with IMP, working, as we said, not only on the issue of disclosure, but the entire management cycle, to help management cycle of input, to really help organizations to make sure that they are managing their impacts and they can actually find the right resources within their bodies to advance on this important agenda.
Thanks, Romina. Eric, thoughts?
Yeah, maybe to build on, Romina, some of your statements or comments. I think one, certainly the focus, and from the UNEP side, and I know from OECD and others as well, we really have to build up on the how. How do you do this? And Dimitrios spoke about, under the PRB, we have the working groups who are really, getting together and how do we establish the soft norms about how you do this, contributing to including policymakers and regulators, because the expectation over time that this will go toward more hard norms or standards, and it probably has to go in that direction, but it's really in the interest of the private sector to be sort of leaning in to this space and trying to work together on how to clarify measurement and management. On the IMP, I think we're working with OECD and others around how do you turn the landscape of initiatives really into a functional ecosystem, so that we know, corporates, banks, and others need a lot of expertise and a lot of support. And the problem is it's still piecemeal where you get this from. And we really need a full operating ecosystem that can provide that information over time, the right sort of data, the right sort of support, expertise, etc. And we're still at very early days of that. We're very excited by the work of the R&D agenda within the IMP. It's very technical, but it's very essential to try to say, what does it mean? Where do we move forward, and what sort of research? Where's further research needed within academia and elsewhere to help sort of really clarify on some of these issues? And I think the last thing in terms of looking forward, Romina, you mentioned the materiality debate, which is still, there are differences by regions. The ISSB has, is going with the notion of enterprise value. Whatever is impacts on value needs to be disclosed. I think one of our ambitions for the year ahead is really how do we clarify the linkage between impact and enterprise value, because it's kind of intuitive, but really there's not enough work done there. And I think a lot more needs to do to really bear it out, to say, well, if you're paying attention to enterprise value, what exactly does that mean? What's all of what's included in your enterprise value you need to be aware of?
Eric, Romina, thank you so much for your thoughts. It's quite clear that there's a lot that still needs to be done. Likewise, Dimitrios and James, for your insights from really where it's actually, a lot of this is actually happening, which is within your organizations. At the end of the day, that's where the change lies. So thank you everyone for your insights. As you can tell, everything is going to be in implementation, operationalization of all of these approaches, and trying to indeed hopefully bring them together as something coherent. And before closing, just wanted to offer a final announcement before we close the Global Roundtable Day 1, which is that in terms of some of the UNEP resources and tools that are available for impact management, in particular for banks. We have a few more resources to kind of top up that toolkit, which are becoming available, and which will be showing you on screen just now, the thumbnails, so that you can find them easily on the website. They're free for download. So do have a look. On the one hand, an impact protocol, which is just a narrative explanation, step by step, of impact management. So indeed, for those starting out on the journey, this hopefully will be helpful before you have to get into very, let's say, nitty-gritty data-based tools. And then the second thing, an assessment module, which is the latest module in our impact management suite of tools for banks, which will help support your efforts for indeed your assessment, your target setting, and setting action plans. Did want to also point to one other thing. There's been reference a couple of times from Romina, from Eric, around the impact management platform, where our organizations, but many other organizations that specialize on sustainability management, whether it's the UN Global Compact, or whether it's the reporting initiatives, whether it's the PRI, the GIN, and many others, where we're converging and trying to arrive indeed at a common understanding of impact management and how that, eventually how we also explain that link to enterprise value. That work has started, as has been said. There's a website, and there's actually an opportunity for everyone to engage with some of that work. There's a very short online survey where you can see some of the common consensus building that has happened around the steps and the actions of impact management. So we very much invite you to familiarize yourself with that information and to give us feedback in terms of the extent to which it's helpful for the framing and for you to understand also that ecosystem of different approaches. What does it mean to do this from an investor perspective, a banking perspective, whether it's more a specialized entity or a mainstream organization, whether using valuation, you're not using valuation. So do have a look and give us your feedback. With that, we are at the end of day one. Thanks again to the speakers, and thank you so much again to all those who attended today. And we very much look forward to welcoming you tomorrow for day 2 of the Global Roundtable 2022. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.